Boldwood presents Hard Times on Weaver Street, written by Chrissie Walsh and read by Katie Sobey. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. To my family, as always. In memory of my dear friend Kay Jones, 1942 to 2023. We could have talked and talked all night. Part 1. Chapter 1. Weaver Street, Liverpool, 1924. Weaver Street was slowly coming to life, the pale morning light swallowing the remains of the night as it spilled over the grey rooftops of the red brick houses. In the big double bed in the front bedroom of number 11, Kitty Conlon lay dreaming. She was standing on the towpath by the glassy river that flowed between banks of drooping willow and riots of colourful wildflowers. Behind her was the cafe she had struggled to buy and turn into a successful business, its blue and white painted boards sparkling in the bright sunshine. The man she loved was coming towards her, and as he drew nearer, she could see the love in his eyes and in the curve of his lips. Her heart swelled, and she held out her hands to greet him. A hot, sticky little hand with pudgy fingers grasped hers and tugged on it. The dream disintegrated. Startled, Kitty's eyes flew open, and in the dim light filtering through the bedroom curtains, she saw her daughter, Molly.
Mammy, I feel poorly. I'm hot and itchy.
Molly gulped back a sob. Kitty shot upright, and scooping Molly up onto the bed, she looked at her closely before running practised hands over her forehead and then into the neck of her nightdress to her chest. The heat rushed into her palms. Holy Mother, the child was burning up. Lay down, darling. Mammy's going to light the mantle. She lowered her daughter onto the pillows, then leapt out of bed, the soles of her feet cold as she crossed the floor. A gusty March wind rattled the window panes. The gaslight popped and flared, eerie shadows dancing over the walls as she hurried back to the bedside.
I'm too hot,
Molly whined, her flushed face wet with tears. Gently, Kitty stripped her daughter of her nightdress, gasping when she saw the mottled red rash. Oh, sweet Jesus! If this was scarlet fever, it was a killer. Her chest tight, she struggled to keep calm. "'Tis all me own fault," she silently berated herself. "I've been so wrapped up in me new house and me wedding that I've neglected her." The wedding? Kitty thrust the thought aside. This was no time to be thinking about getting married. Only yesterday morning, as they'd got ready to walk to school in the pouring rain, 6-year-old Molly had complained of a sore throat. "And what did I do?" Kitty fumed. "I gave her a jalop of honey and lemon and told her that'd cure it." Crippled with guilt, she held Molly against her breast, murmuring soothing words and stroking her hot little back. Her skin felt like sandpaper. Then she laid her in the bed and pulled up the covers. Molly pushed them aside, her wails getting louder and louder.
I itch all over and my throat hurts,
she croaked, big fat tears rolling down her cheeks. Lay still, darling. Mammy's going for something to make you feel better. Kitty rushed to the bathroom and was back in seconds with cool, damp flannels. She bathed Molly's flushed face and then her chest and back, and with each simple action she could feel panic building in her chest. Molly's cries abated. She gazed helplessly at her mother, her bright blue eyes awash like delphiniums after a shower of rain. Kitty gazed back, her jangled thoughts alerted by the patter of feet on the landing. She darted to the door. "No, Patrick," she ordered, barring his way into the room. "Be a big, brave boy for Mammy. Go ye back to bed, and I'll be along in a minute." Patrick stuck out his lip, then began to bawl. Kitty didn't know which way to turn. "Help, Mammy, darling," she cried, as she shooed her 4-year-old son back to the bedroom he shared with his sister. "Molly's sick, and I don't want you catching it, so stay here like a good boy. I'm going to fetch Auntie Maggie and the doctor." Shocked by the urgency of her words, Patrick climbed onto his bed. He looked like a gnome in striped pyjamas.
"Me be a good boy. Stay here. Molly's sick," he said.
"That's right, darling," Kitty said, relief washing over her as she hurried from the room and down the stairs, hurtling across the kitchen and out of the back door. Rain had fallen during the night, and the mad March wind tugged frantically at Kitty's nightdress as, skidding and slipping, she ran to the house next door. It was bitterly cold, and her flesh froze, her chilled knuckles stinging as she hammered on the peeling green panels. "Maggie! Maggie! For God's sake, answer the door!"
"What the?"
Maggie Stubbs stared through bleary eyes. She was also still in her nightclothes, her face puffy with sleep and her bleached blonde hair hanging like rats' tails. "What's up?" "Go and mind the kids while I go for the doctor. Molly's got scarlet fever."
"Are you sure?"
Maggie asked, grabbing her coat from behind the door. "I think so," Kitty panted, already halfway back to her own house. The two women hurried inside. "Don't let our Patrick near her," Kitty warned as she pulled on her coat. "I'll go and see if I can rouse Dr. Metcalfe." She looked frantically at Maggie. "Of all the times for this to happen," she wailed. "Go on," Maggie urged. "I'll see to him. It might not be as bad as you think." "Open wide, young lady." Dr. Metcalfe peered into Molly's mouth. You were right to be alarmed. Tongue swollen and coated," he mumbled, running his bony fingers under Molly's chin. "And the neck slightly swollen. And, of course, there's the rash." He straightened and turned to Kitty. "She's not the worst case I've seen, Mrs. Conlon, but I'll have to send her to Oxford Street. Can't risk the spread of infection." He picked up his bag. "I'll arrange for the ambulance." At the mention of the isolation hospital in the city and the ambulance, Kitty burst into tears. "How long will we have to wait?" she sobbed. "Who can tell?" Dr. Metcalfe replied laconically. "Keep her cool and comfortable." He shambled from the room, a tall, spare man bent with age. Kitty stared at his back, wild-eyed. Then she clattered down the stairs after him. The doctor paused at the front door. "Keep the boy away from her. I'll let Oxford Street know you're coming. I'll be back shortly." Kitty's knees sagged as the door closed behind him. The next hour seemed interminable. As she sat by the bed, she recalled the time George Metcalfe had attended her aged neighbour, Marjorie Boothroyd. He'd taken one look at Marjorie, saying, "Bad heart, nothing I can do. Let her die in her own bed." And she had, 2 hours later. A shiver ran down Kitty's spine. Molly tossed and whimpered, and almost choking with panic, Kitty applied yet more cool cloths to her skin. "Sweet Jesus, what's keeping him?" she cried hysterically. "Where's that blasted ambulance?" "It'll be on its way, Queen. Don't get yourself in a state," Maggie soothed. "You'll only set her off again." She nodded at Molly, who was now lying quite still, her eyes tightly shut. Maggie was standing outside the bedroom door on guard duty. Patrick wheeled his cars up and down the landing, asking every 2 minutes,
"When will Molly be better?"
"Take him down and give him some breakfast," Kitty said, her voice ragged. "The porridge is in the cupboard by the sink." "Yeah, I know," Maggie said, making for the stairs, and Patrick skipped after her, brightening visibly at the idea of the house getting back to normal. When Kitty heard the front door open again, she ran to the head of the stairs. Dr. Metcalfe's grey head bobbed up to meet her. She hurried back to the bedroom, the doctor plodding behind her. He set down his bag, then slowly pulled off his thick woolen gloves. "Bitterly cold morning, Mrs. Conlon," he remarked. Kitty felt like screaming. She opened her mouth, and when the words came out, she was surprised how calm she sounded. "Where's the ambulance?" "Ah, well, there's the thing," Dr. Metcalfe said heavily. "The Oxford doesn't have a place for her. Overcrowded, you know, what with all this diphtheria and fever going about." He harumphed. "Not enough beds, not enough nurses." Kitty paled. So what do we do? Where will she go?
Her voice had almost risen to a shriek.
I've given it careful thought, he said ponderously, and I say we keep her here. Far less infection in this house than at the Oxford.
But how will she get better if she's not in hospital?
Hopefully with your good care and mine, Mrs. Conlon,
he said, taking a small packet of yellow powder from his bag and giving Kitty an enigmatic smile.
You see, Mrs. Conlon, I've long believed that infection spreads infection. Where is there more infection than in an isolation ward, I ask you?
Kitty suppressed a groan.
When I learned that they didn't have a bed for her in the Oxford, or anywhere else in the city for that matter, I thought, where can the child receive the best care she can get? He continued, and the answer was obvious. At home with her mother.
He moved to the side of the bed.
Fortunately, you're a sensible woman, Mrs. Conlon, unlike some who call me out at the first sneeze or clutter up my waiting room with nothing more than a cut finger that simply requires a plaster.
Kitty supposed she should have felt flattered, but his prevarications were sorely trying her patience.
So, what do we do now? She asked curtly.
We start by easing the throat,
he said, opening the packet of yellow powder. Kitty watched him take a sheet of white paper from his bag and form it into a cone. He next produced a teaspoon and inserted it in the packet of powder.
Watch carefully, Mrs. Conlon, he ordered, withdrawing the spoon. Flowers of sulphur, 1 level teaspoonful.
He shook the powder from the spoon into the cone and set it on the bedside table. Then, smiling gently at Molly and tweaking her nose, he said,
Now, young lady, I'm going to work some magic to make you feel better. Raise her up on the pillows, Mother.
Kitty propped Molly up. The doctor lifted the cone.
Open wide, Molly, he said,
then demonstrated with his own mouth. Molly's eyes were bright with fever and fear as she formed a big O.
Time for a bit of magic, he continued, inserting the end of the cone in her mouth.
Mesmerised, Molly could do little else other than make a soft moaning noise. Kitty's mouth had gone dry as she watched him blow gently into the cone. Molly gasped, then spluttered, and spluttered again, violently. She fell back on the pillows, breathless. Kitty bit her lip. What had he done? Molly gasped and swallowed a few more times, then gave a little smile.
My throat's not scratching any more, she said.
Until now, Kitty had considered Dr. George Metcalfe to be an old dodderer. It was rumoured that he was a bit too fond of the whiskey bottle, and she'd caught the whiff of something sharp on his breath. He seems sober enough, but then it's not yet 9 a.m. But does he know what he's doing? She really didn't know what to think. Apart from the time she'd had an abscess in her ear and Patrick had croup, she'd had little to do with him. Now, as she looked into her daughter's flushed, smiling face and thought of the comforting manner he was using with Molly, she found her opinion changing.
Now, Mother, you can work the magic twice a day for 3 days, but I suggest you mix the sulphur with a spoonful of treacle. It's easier that way. You do have treacle?
Kitty nodded.
A big tin. I use it in me bacon.
Dr. Metcalfe gave a satisfied nod, then turned his attention to Molly, who was lying peacefully on the pillows. Kitty could have kissed him.
There, Molly, he burred. The magic's getting to work.
He glanced up into Kitty's fraught face.
We caught it early. Carry on with the bathing to keep down the fever, and this will stop the itching.
He delved in his bag, then handed Kitty a brown bottle.
Calamine, an ancient but marvellous remedy.
He patted Molly's arm.
She's young and strong, so keep your chin up, and she'll be as right as rain within a month or so.
Kitty sagged.
A month or so,
she echoed. The wedding was less than 6 weeks away. Dr. Metcalfe stepped away from the bed, his ageing limbs creaking as he packed his bag and gave further instructions.
Keep to this one room, just you and Molly. Hang a sheet soaked in carbolic over the door to stop the spread of infection, and make sure you wash her cups and dishes thoroughly."
He turned to check on his patient, and assured he had done what he could for now, he said,
"I'll call back after midday."
Molly was dozing, worn out by the fever and the unusual events of the morning. Kitty followed him out to the landing and down the stairs. As they stood in the hallway, they could hear Patrick and Maggie hooting and laughing in the kitchen.
"If you take my advice, you'll send the lad to a relative for a few weeks. Keep him out of harm's way,"
the doctor said, and as Kitty opened the front door to let him out, he added,
"And you might put a sign on the doors, warning of infection in the house."
Kitty felt a flash of panic.
"Send Patrick away? A sign on the door? Oh, my God!" I will, Doctor. I'll do everything you say. And thank you for all you've done for Molly,"
she gabbled, grabbing his hand and shaking it vigorously. It felt like a bundle of twigs. Dr. Metcalfe smiled wearily.
"It's my job, Mrs. Conlon."
Kitty watched him go, thinking what a wonderful old gentleman he was. Then she hurried back upstairs and daubed the lotion on Molly's angry rash. That seemed to do the trick, and when Molly began to doze again, Kitty ran down into the kitchen, just in time to see Patrick flinging a cushion at Maggie. She tossed it back. Patrick whooped as he caught it.
"Woo!"
yelled Maggie just as loudly.
"Dead on, kid!"
Kitty's nerves already frayed, she yelled,
"Hey, them's me good cushions! You'll knock something over!"
She glared at Maggie.
"Catch yourself on, woman!" "I'm keeping him occupied,"
Maggie said to Kitty, and to Patrick.
"We're having fun, aren't we?" "Trust you to create havoc,"
Kitty said, picking up a cushion and at the same time giving Maggie a contrite grin. Pull yourself together, she chastised herself, annoyed at sounding so ungrateful. Maggie was her dearest friend, always there for her. Over the years, they had stuck by one another through thick and thin.
"It's all right," said Maggie, unperturbed. "What did the doc say?"
Before Kitty could embark on the detail, the back door opened and Mavis Robson walked in, looking anxious. She lived 2 doors up at number 15.
"I saw the doctor's car at your door, Kitty, and I wondered who was ill. It's Molly. She has scarlet fever."
Kitty felt as if she might crumble into tiny pieces at any minute. She was itching to get back upstairs and check on her daughter, but arrangements had to be made for Patrick. As she told Mavis and Maggie what Dr. Metcalfe had said, her troubles were immediately lessened.
"I'll take him,"
Mavis offered, her little currant-bun eyes twinkling and her smile beseeching.
"I'm due some leave from the hotel, and I'd love to have him. It'll be easier for me to look after him than you, Maggie," she continued, glancing in Maggie's direction. "It'll be company for me, and you have enough fun with Lily and Vi."
Lily was Maggie's 7-year-old daughter, and Vi Bottomley her mother. Maggie grimaced, then lit a cigarette. Kitty's heart warmed at Mavis's eagerness. She knew exactly how Mavis felt. Mavis's fiancé had been killed in the war, and she had never married, but she still had yearnings to be a mother. She smiled at the small, birdy woman who was the pastry chef in the Adelphi Hotel. Then she thought of her cafe on the towpath. She owned and ran it single-handed. She'd have to close down for now.
"That's very kind of you, Mavis."
She turned to Patrick, who was wheeling cars across the table.
"What do you say to going for a wee holiday to sleep in Auntie Mavis's house, Patrick?"
Amazed, Patrick's eyes boggled. Then his brow furrowed.
"Sleep there?"
he said in a wobbly voice, looking anxiously at his mother, then at Mavis.
"Will you make them buns with pink icing on? And will Jack let me dig in the allotments?"
He was still in his pyjamas. Mavis glowed.
"As many as you like, Patrick, and Jack'll let you dig with him," she said enthusiastically, sure that Jack would do that just to please her.
She and Jack Norton, who lived at number 17, were the closest of friends, and although the little spinster and the lame, one-eyed bachelor still kept to their own houses at bedtime, they spent so much time together that it didn't prevent Maggie from speculating that they were more than just good friends.
After all, they're still only in their 30s, and they must have needs, she'd say lewdly, and, sighing, I know I bloody do. When she went on about it, Kitty told her it was nobody's business but Mavis and Jack's. "What will you do about the cafe?" asked Mavis, ever the practical one. "Close it for now, and just when it's coming up to Easter," Kitty said despondently. "I'll miss the trade, but I'm sure my customers will understand." Mavis gave an emphatic nod. "Of course they will, and they'll come flocking back once the weather turns." Kitty smiled gratefully. Mavis always managed to say the right thing. "I'll get Patrick dressed," she said before turning to Maggie. "Thanks, love, for being such a pal. You really helped me out this morning." She didn't for one moment want Maggie to think she was ungrateful, or that she was favouring Mavis over her. Maggie prided herself on being Kitty's greatest ally, and Kitty was the first to acknowledge that she'd seen her through some of the roughest times in her life. "Think nothing of it, Queen," said Maggie, airily blowing out a cloud of smoke. "Do you want a hand putting up that carbolic sheet?"
Chapter 2. Later that same afternoon, long after Patrick had toddled off with Mavis and Maggie had helped her hang the carbolic sheet over the door, Kitty was sitting with Molly in the darkened bedroom. She'd been there for most of the day. As promised, Dr. Metcalfe had called again to check that Molly was not deteriorating, but it had done little to calm her anxiety. When he'd said he would visit that evening, she had begun to doubt his words. He was being awfully vigilant. Did he really believe Molly would get better? Outside, the sky was black, and rain spattered against the window. Wearily, Kitty lit the gas mantles. 2 bright yellow orbs sputtered and popped, lighting up the darkest corners.
"Don't, Mammy,"
Molly wailed.
"They hurt my eyes." "Sorry, darling, but I have to if you're wanting another story. Mammy can't see to read in the dark."
"No more stories, Mammy,"
Molly said drowsily.
"Just sit and hold my hand."
Kitty lowered the mantles, the pale, sickly light adding to her despondency as she sat holding Molly's hot little hand. Molly said she itched all over. Her mother dabbed on more lotion, aching to change places with her little girl and spare her the discomfort. She breathed a sigh of relief when eventually Molly fell asleep. Kitty let her gaze roam the gloomy room, her eyes coming to rest on the edge of the carbolic sheet, visible through a narrow gap in the door. They'd soaked the sheet in the bath, then smeared carbolic soap all over it, Maggie getting wet right up to her armpits in order to prove her usefulness. Then Kitty had climbed on a chair to fix it to the top of the doorframe. Maggie had stood below, passing up the drawing pins. As Kitty climbed down, the weight of the water and soap tugged the pins out of the wood. Like a sopping wet wraith, the sheet enveloped Maggie in its sticky folds. She flailed her arms and kicked out her feet, but the more she struggled, the more she became entangled. Kitty laughed for the first time that day. She was still laughing when Maggie had burst from the sheet, spitting out carbolic and her hair plastered to her scalp. But she didn't feel like laughing now. Stealthily, so as not to disturb Molly, she got to her feet and went to the window. She gazed at the rosy, red-brick houses on the opposite side of the street, houses just like her own, 2 windows above and a bay window below at the side of the front door. The wet pavements glistened in the light from the gas lamps, and the sparsely branched plane trees that never seemed to grow, one outside every 3rd house, swayed in the wind. 8 years. Was it really 8 years since she had come to live in Weaver Street? She marvelled at the thought. 8 years that had seen her change from a feisty young girl with her head in the clouds to an adoring mother, then a disillusioned wife, and finally an independent businesswoman. Suddenly, she was assailed by memories. Resting her hands on the windowsill and her forehead against a cold glass pane, Kitty recollected her joys and her sorrows. Molly and Patrick were the children of the devastatingly handsome Tom Conlon, The man she had fallen head over heels in love with and married in Dublin. A man she barely knew. He was the reason she had come to live in Liverpool in the summer of 1916. His great-uncle Tom had left them the house, and its contents, in Weaver Street. Although the war was raging, they had packed their bags and crossed the Irish Sea to take up residence, hardly able to believe their good fortune. Then, Kitty had thought the world was her oyster. She had fallen in love with the house in Weaver Street, with its back door and garden looking out onto a lane and the allotments beyond, and its front door opening onto the street that at the bottom had a public house, the Weavers' Arms, and at the top, St. Joseph's Catholic Church. After a shaky start with one or two of her neighbours, they didn't like the Irish, she had made the truest friends she would ever have, and any yearnings she might have had for her home in Ireland had long since faded. Kitty had believed that Tom loved her as much as she had loved him. Oh, how they had loved! It had been magical, too good to be true. And it had proved to be so. Coming to Weaver Street had been hers and Tom's undoing. Tom had been a bookmaker. Shortly after they arrived, he had opened a betting shop in the back room of the Weavers' Arms pub. The business had been improving steadily when, much to his dismay, Tom was called up to fight in the war. After a stint in the Navy, in which he had been slightly injured, Tom returned a changed man. Whatever way she looked at it, Kitty now reflected as her eyes rested on the roof of the Weaver's Arms, he had changed from being a loving husband into an avaricious, unfaithful playboy with delusions of grandeur. He had reopened the betting shop, and as the money had rolled in, love had flown out of the window. Kitty stepped back and drew the curtains, then crossed to the dressing table, her mind still playing with memories as she gazed at her reflection in the mirror. A tired-looking young woman with golden-flecked hazel eyes in a finely shaped face framed by lustrous tawny curls gazed back at her. I was 19 when I first stood in this bedroom and looked in this mirror. Just a girl, newly married with no children, and all me life before me. She remembered how she and Tom had laughed at the big, ornate double bed with its high carved ends, and how they'd tumbled into it on that first night. I never thought then that 3 years on, we'd not even be sleeping in the same room. As Tom's prowess on the gambling circuit at the racetracks had thrived, so had his lust for the high society life that he craved. In the last year of their marriage, when Kitty discovered that he was involved in an adulterous relationship with the daughter of a wealthy horse owner and trainer, and was preparing to leave her, she had refused to share his bed, and had grown used to their being apart, but not apart. Like ships that pass in the night, she'd thought then. Now, as she began to tidy her brushes and combs, hairpins and pots of makeup, she thought, not for the first time, that maybe Tom had been that sort of man from the start, and she too much in love to notice his flaws. When she became aware that the only person of any significance in Tom's life was himself, and that he was prepared to sacrifice his family to achieve his ambitions, she had made plans to ensure her own and her children's futures. To realise that she and Molly and Patrick meant so little to Tom had devastated Kitty, and had it not been for the support of her good friends, she doubted she would have coped during those dark days. But somehow she had. Smiling wryly, she went and sat beside the bed, gazing fondly at her sleeping daughter. Molly's glossy black curls scribbled the pillow, and although her eyes were closed, Kitty knew they were the brightest blue, just like her father's. He might have betrayed you, Kitty, but you won through in the end, she thought, recalling how she had struggled to buy the cafe where once she had waited on tables. She'd worked her fingers to the bone to make that happen. She'd taken in sewing, altering garments for her customers when new clothes were in short supply. She'd also learned to bake. Mavis had taught her how to bake professionally in readiness for when she bought the cafe. Then she had worked in munitions making shells, the memory of which still made her shudder, for it was whilst she was working in the factory that she almost lost her life in a massive explosion, and surely would have done had it not been for the wonderful man who was soon to become her second husband. John Sykes to the rescue,
she mused. He's always on hand when I need him most. Sure, wasn't it him who got me safe home on that awful winter's day when I got caught in a blizzard and me ready to give birth to Patrick? Reaching out and stroking Molly's brow, she was still sleeping, Kitty recalled how John had fetched the midwife, then stayed and looked after Molly, and later, as she'd cradled her son, he'd brought her tea and made sure she had all she needed. I don't know how I missed the love in his eyes then. I must have been blind. The memory of Patrick's birth made her think how lucky she had been to have John's staunch friendship, because in those days she had looked on him only as a good friend. However, when he confessed his love for her, she realised she had always been in love with him, and now she was free, she returned that love with every breath in her body. Her heart lurched as she thought of John. Their wedding was so soon, but if anything worse happened to Molly, would she still be able to go through with it? She buried her face in her hands. What if Molly were to die? Surely a wedding would be out of the question, no matter how much she loved John. Was this God's way of punishing her for not attending Mass every Sunday? Or was it his way of letting her know that he didn't approve of widows marrying? To those whom God has joined in holy matrimony, let no man put asunder. But Tom's dead, and he didn't love me anyway, she protested, as one crazy thought after another filled her head. Oh, blessed Mother Mary, most holy, help me. She closed her eyes and folded her hands in prayer. She begged forgiveness for all her sins and pleaded with the Blessed Virgin to spare her beautiful daughter and let her marry John. I love this man with all my heart, she told her, and he loves and respects me. I was a good wife, and will be again if you intercede for me, my blessed mother. You are a woman like me. Ask God to grant me that favour. Lifting her head from her hands, Kitty opened her eyes. She sat perfectly still, feeling calm and serene. It was as if some unseen hand had poured a soothing balm into her frenzied mind and troubled heart. She took a deep breath, convinced that the Holy Mother had listened. I should have pointed out that it had to be before the 3rd of May. She got to her feet and went downstairs to heat a drop of soup. Maybe she could tempt Molly when she wakened. As she waited for the soup to heat, she wondered if other women who were marrying for a second time dwelt on their first marriage. She shook her head. "'Tis a great day for the memories," she told herself ruefully. More often than not, whenever Kitty thought of Tom, she chose to remember him as the man who had swept her off her feet, and not the avaricious adulterer he had been at the time of his death. Now, Tom was in the graveyard at the top of Weaver Street, and whilst she had grieved his passing, she reasoned that they would not have spent the rest of their lives together. John had restored Kitty's happiness and her faith in human nature. And although she might never forget the hurt that he had caused her, there would always be a tiny corner of her heart that belonged to Tom Conlon. Life hadn't turned out quite like she had expected, mused Kitty, as she poured soup into a cup, and at times she found it hard to believe how, in the space of 8 years, her life had been filled with so much grief, and yet so much happiness. Bewildered, she shook her head to dispel such thoughts, and placing the cup on a saucer, she hurried upstairs. Molly wouldn't take any soup. Disappointed, Kitty sat and held her hand while Molly dozed. Kitty's eyes drooped and her chin sank to her chest. She felt utterly drained. But when she heard John's car purr to a halt at her front door, she hurried to the bedroom door, walking slap-bang into the wet, sticky sheet now held in place by a few nails. Cursing softly, she blundered round it and ran downstairs. John met her in the hallway. Kitty put up a staying hand. John's eyes widened. "Don't come any further," she panted.
Whatever do you mean?"
he cried, taking a step towards her. He saw the strain on her face and the frightened look in her eyes. His heart missed a beat. "Molly's got scarlet fever," she said brokenly. Her reserves crumbling, she pitched into John's arms, pressing her face into his chest.
He wrapped her in his embrace, stroked her hair, and felt her tears dampen his shirt. Kitty clung to him, feeling his warmth and strength seep into her cold, tired body. Already she felt stronger and braver. She pulled away from him.
"I don't know that I should even be touching you,"
she said, her voice wobbling.
"I might give it to you."
"I'll take my chances."
John kissed her.
"Now, take me up to see her."
"You can't go in the room,"
Kitty warned as they mounted the stairs. She held aside the damp sheet as John peered across the distance at Molly. She lay flat on her back, her flushed, pretty face framed by a halo of black curls fanning the pillow. Her eyes were closed, but he knew they were the brightest blue. Whilst Patrick favoured Kitty with his tawny hair and hazel eyes, there was no mistaking that Molly was Tom Conlon's daughter. But John had grown to love both children as though they were his own. They stood in the doorway watching Molly as Kitty softly told John all that had happened that day.
"What if she doesn't get better?"
she concluded with a sob.
"She will," John insisted. "She has you and the doctor taking care of her. And as he said, you've caught it early."
"Scarlet fever's a killer. It can lead to meningitis or pneumonia, so I've heard," Kitty said hollowly. "The postman lost his little lad to it last year. They thought he'd pulled through, then he got meningitis and died."
"But he wasn't Molly, Kitty. Don't fall into the trap of imagining the worst. Molly's strong and healthy."
"She's not now,"
Kitty said forlornly.
"And just when we thought everything was going to plan, the house near finished and the wedding all organised."
She turned and plodded wearily along the landing and down the stairs.
"And it will go to plan," John persisted as he followed her. "Did you get in touch with the Adelphi about the food for the reception?"
Kitty, now at the foot of the stairs, whirled round to face him, angry red spots burning her cheeks.
"I can't be bothered with things like that now,"
she said harshly, amazed that he could think about something so trivial.
"There won't be a wedding if she doesn't get better."
She strutted into the kitchen, her back rigid. Kitty's pronouncement was so bleak that John's stomach plummeted. He hurried after her.
"You're overwrought and need some rest. Go and lie down in Patrick's room. I'll keep an eye on Molly. I'll call out if I need you."
He pulled Kitty into his arms, kissed her tenderly, then ushered her back into the hallway.
"Off you go. Get some sleep. I'll waken you before I go home."
Kitty didn't argue. Chapter 3. One day blurred into another. All of Kitty's waking hours were spent nursing Molly, and her friends and neighbours pitched in to lend a hand wherever they could. Maggie did the shopping, Beth and Mavis made tasty meals, and May Walker washed and ironed for her. Kitty was overwhelmed, but not surprised, by their kindness. But as 1 week drifted into 2, she began to wonder if this imposed state of affairs was the shape of things to come. Although Molly didn't appear to be getting any worse, no signs of meningitis or pneumonia, neither did she appear to be getting better. She was fretful and listless, her pleas of, "Don't leave me, Mummy," tearing at Kitty's heart, and tears streaming down her cheeks as, in the 2nd week, she cried, "Mummy, my skin's coming off." Whenever something catastrophic happened in her life, Kitty didn't look for sympathy or seek pity. She simply wanted her old life back, everything just as it had been before Molly caught scarlet fever. She felt as though her life had been stolen from her, and it was soul-crushing. Day after day, she peered into Molly's throat, and at night she listened to her breathing, her ears alert for signs of pneumonia as she watched Molly's chest rise and fall. At other times, she'd gaze into her dull blue eyes, trying to detect the dreaded meningitis. Kitty had heard that it had something to do with the brain. Dr. Metcalfe called often. He seemed pleased with Molly's progress.
"See, we've caught it in time," he said cheerily. "And, yes, peeling skin is only to be expected. Give it time, Mrs. Conlon. Give it time."
But time was something Kitty didn't have. She couldn't and wouldn't dream of neglecting her daughter, She loved her too much for that thought to even enter her head. However, she was extremely aware of all the other things she needed to be doing. Molly and Lily's bridesmaids' dresses needed sewing, and the things they were taking with them to the new house needed packing. It seemed ages since she had walked across the lane to what was going to be her home, and she felt cheated at not being there to see the progress that John assured her was being made. The more she thought about it, the more there seemed to need doing. Time was running out.
I can't help panicking when I think of what's to be done before the wedding, she told Maggie one day at the end of the 3rd week of Molly's illness. She was standing at her back door, still too afraid of letting anyone other than John into the house in case of infection. Maggie had scorned the idea, and when Kitty had reminded her she needed to protect Lily, she'd replied,
Lily's as tough as old boots.
Now, Maggie dumped the groceries she had fetched for Kitty on the doorstep, then lit a cigarette.
Don't go thinking you can use your Molly as an excuse to back out now, she said, jabbing the cigarette in Kitty's direction.
I wasn't thinking anything of the sort, Kitty snapped. I'm just saying I don't know how I'm going to manage it. I didn't want to call it off, but
in that case, you'd best make a list of what needs doing, and me, Beth and Mavis will do what we can. Don't we always help one another out?
Kitty nodded, but she didn't look convinced.
I can't see Beth doing much, she sighed. She'll not come near as long as she thinks there's any chance of her catching anything. You know how she is about her health since she lost the baby.
Beth, who lived at number 13, was also a very close friend of Kitty's. She had miscarried her first pregnancy due to a bout of flu, and being of a nervous disposition and desperate to conceive again, she was too afraid to do anything other than leave food on the doorstep.
Not that I should be complaining, Kitty continued. She sent another tasty shepherd's pie and a casserole round this week, and although I wash the dishes in scalding water and leave them on the wall for her to collect, I bet she washes them all over again, she remarked. Knowing her, she more likely smashes them and chucks them in the bin.
Maggie could never resist getting a dig in at prim and proper Beth, partly because her timidity and sense of propriety irritated the hell out of Maggie, and furthermore, she was jealous. She didn't like sharing Kitty.
Well, like I said, tell us what you want doing and we'll get stuck in, Maggie said in a businesslike manner.
Kitty raised her eyebrows. It wasn't like Maggie to be so organised. It was usually the other way round, Kitty sorting out Maggie's chaotic life.
I can't expect you to pack my house up and cart stuff across the lane.
Kitty didn't like feeling beholden to anyone.
And why not? You do the same for us. Beth Forsyth wouldn't be married to Blair if you hadn't given her the gumption to stand up to her rotten dad, and I'd still be Fred's punch bag if you hadn't helped me throw him out. Packing a few boxes and moving bits of furniture is the least we can do.
Oh, Maggie, what would I do without you?
Kitty sounded close to tears.
What would any of us do without you is more to the point.
Maggie's voice was thick with emotion.
Go on then, make a list of jobs and sing to Margaret Stubbs, the saviour of Weaver Street. We'll do the rest.
Maggie went off to ask the grocer for some empty cardboard boxes before she went back to her mending frame. Before she got pregnant, Maggie had been a weaver at Holroyd's, the cloth mill in Mill Lane. Faced with having to give up her job, she had trained as a mender. Then she'd given up working in the mill shortly before she gave birth to Lily, and still needing an income, she now worked on a mending frame in her own front room, fixing the flaws that marred the fine worsted cloth's parallel perfection. Fred, her estranged husband, had been a wife-batterer. Kitty hurried back upstairs, keeping an eye on her daughter's health, and finding things to amuse her was a full-time occupation. She was helping Molly make a jigsaw when she heard the knock on the back door. At least twice every day, Mavis brought Patrick to see his mother.
That'll be Patrick and Mavis, Kitty said. I'll just pop down and have a word.
Molly nodded solemnly.
Mammy, I'm sorry Patrick can't come home.
She looked so penitent, Kitty's heart went out to her.
You've done nothing to be sorry for, darling,
she cried, hugging her daughter, and thinking how cruel it was that she should blame herself for her illness.
I won't be long. See if you can find the pieces to finish the rabbit before I get back.
Molly smiled, and Kitty hurried downstairs. Patrick was on the other side of the wall that separated Kitty's garden from Beth's, at a safe enough distance, so his mother deemed. She was still terrified of spreading the infection. His face lit up when he saw her. Kitty perched on the wall, her heart swelling at the sight of her son. Oh, how she missed him.
"Well, darling, what have you been up to?" she asked cheerily.
"Me and Auntie Mavis went to the park, and we made buns, and I put icing on them. And me and Jack made a fort out of boxes. Jack's going to get soldiers for it,"
he blithely gabbled. Mavis smiled at his use of the courtesy title. She wasn't related to either Kitty or Maggie, but it pleased her when their children called her Auntie. Kitty felt a twinge of envy. It should be her he was doing these things with. But then he came nearer, his smile slipping. He looked up at her, his hazel eyes teary and his voice cracking as he said,
"When can I come home, Mammy?"
Kitty's jealousy rapidly dissipated. She ached to lift him into her arms and kiss him.
"Soon, love," she said.
Dr. Metcalfe had told her that the chances of spreading the infection lessened with each passing day.
"Can I go and play with the kittens?"
Patrick glanced hopefully at the allotment, his homesickness forgotten. Jack had found a nest of abandoned kittens and put them in a box in his shed.
"If Jack says you can, darling,"
she said, marvelling at how children rarely dwelt on grief when there was something more appealing to be getting on with.
"And perhaps it's as well," she thought, "'cause who knows what sorrows they'll have to deal with as they grow older."
Sadly, she watched her son go back to Mavis's house. When John came round that evening, she told him of Maggie's offer to start packing up the house.
"That's a grand idea,"
he said.
"I've already moved the furniture from my place. The painters have finished, and all Frank has to do is varnish the floorboards, and his mate to put some tiles up."
Once again, Kitty couldn't help feeling as though she was missing out on things.
"What does it look like?"
she asked eagerly.
"Just perfect. Like you,"
said John, cupping her face in both hands, then tenderly running his thumbs under the dark shadows under her eyes.
"You look worn out, love. But guess what?"
He gave a wicked chuckle.
"Our new bed arrives tomorrow, and after we're married, you can catch up on all the sleep you've missed."
He pulled her into his arms and kissed her. "Is that what we'll be doing? Sleeping?" she asked coquettishly. John laughed out loud, and Kitty felt the weight of the past 3 weeks leaving her shoulders and her heart. Regardless of how bad things had seemed, John's love and the kindness and compassion of Maggie, Mavis, May and Beth had sustained her. She flung her arms round her intended husband and planted a smacking kiss on his waiting lips. The next morning, Maggie lumbered in with a pile of flattened cardboard boxes and a fat roll of sticky tape.
"I'll make 'em back up and start filling 'em with stuff from your front room," she announced importantly.
"That'll be grand," Kitty said. "Leave the sewing machine in case I need it again. I finished the bridesmaids' dresses and me own, but you never know what'll crop up. John's been sitting with Molly to let me get on with him, bless him."
"He's a lovely fella, Kitty.
You don't know how lucky you are."
Maggie sounded wistful.
"Oh, but I do,"
Kitty replied. Chapter 4.
"I think it's safe to say that this young lady's out of the woods, Mrs. Conlon."
Dr. Metcalfe gently placed his hand on Molly's brow and smiled down at her. She gave him a smile, all teeth. 4 weeks had passed since Kitty first sent for him, and now her heart soared to hear his words. She turned to him, her face alight with gratitude.
"And it's thanks to ye," she said fulsomely. "If you hadn't watched over her like the Good Shepherd, I dread to think what might have happened. I'll never be able to thank you enough."
Her eyes moistened as relief swept over her.
"Think nothing of it, Mrs. Conlon. I did my job, and you played your part," he said gruffly.
But Kitty could tell he appreciated her thanks.
"Does that mean Patrick can come back home, Mammy?"
Molly gleefully asked. Kitty chuckled.
"I never thought I'd hear her say that. She's usually telling him to leave her be."
"Yes, Molly," said the doctor, laughing along with Kitty. "Your brother can return to the bosom of his family."
He picked up his worn leather bag, his jovial smile suddenly making him look 10 years younger. Molly's eyes flew to Kitty's pert breasts beneath her flowered apron.
"I don't have bosoms," she chirped. "But I will when I'm as old as Mammy."
She picked at a flake of peeling skin off the end of her nose and flicked it onto the bed cover. Laughing even louder, George Metcalfe pronounced,
"A complete recovery. Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Conlon?"
Kitty positively danced down the stairs as she showed him to the front door. A week had passed since the doctor had given Molly the all-clear, and she had begged her mother to let her go back to school. She'd had a joyous reunion with her friend, Lily, and was now keen to let her school friends know about her narrow escape from scarlet fever. It made her feel quite important. Kitty had had some misgivings about letting her go back to school so soon, but when she saw how happy Molly was to be back in Lily's company, she'd relented. The late April morning was dry and sunny as they walked up Weaver Street, then down Mill Lane, Molly and Lily holding hands and chattering 19 to the dozen, and Kitty and Patrick bringing up the rear. They left Molly and Lily at the school gates. Kitty had called the previous day to tell the teacher that Dr. Metcalfe no longer considered Molly infectious, and the teacher had welcomed the news.
"I'm so pleased she made a good recovery, Mrs. Conlon. I'll be glad to have her back," the teacher had said. "She's a lovely girl, so well-mannered and clever too."
Kitty had never doubted Molly's attributes, but it was nice to hear someone else sing her praises. Now, as Kitty and Patrick headed for home, a sudden April shower had them quickening their paces.
"Come on, love, let's make a dash for it."
Kitty grasped Patrick's pudgy hand as raindrops big as pennies began pelting the pavements. Patrick pumped his short, sturdy legs, glad that he would soon be in the warm, dry haven of his mammy's kitchen and not inside the grim school building close by the mill. It was all right for big girls like his sister Molly and Lily Stubbs, who at 6 and 7 respectively had to go every weekday, but he preferred to be at home. And boy, was he glad to be back living with his mammy and Molly again. Auntie Mavis and Jack were nice, but they weren't as nice as his mammy and his sister.
"Here we are,"
Kitty panted, opening the front door and ducking into the shelter of the hallway with Patrick at her heels.
"Take off, you darling,"
she said, stooping to unbutton his tweed overcoat, then pulling it off and shaking the rain out of it.
"Get you in by the fire and dry off."
Patrick needed no second bidding. Kitty took off her coat and hung it on the hall stand. As she did so, her image was reflected in its little mirror. She gazed at her reflection. Not bad for 27, and soon to be a bride again, she thought, patting her damp curls. Her mood still thoughtful, she went into the kitchen. Patrick was on his knees on the hearthrug in front of the fire.
"Brr,"
he rumbled as he whirled one of his favourite toy cars round in circles. Kitty smiled. Him and his beloved cars, and football. He was a lovely child, and she felt blessed to have brought 2 such beautiful children into the world, and furthermore, she knew without a doubt that she'd fight tooth and nail to make their futures bright. They were her number 1 priority.
"Are your socks dry?"
She bent down to feel Patrick's toes, squeezing none too gently. He wiggled his feet, laughing as he rolled free. He held a car in each hand.
"Which do you want to be? Red or blue?"
he chirped, setting the cars on the lino. Kitty had played this game 100 times. "Blue," she said, as Patrick whizzed one car after the other across the floor. Kitty's collided with the table leg, but the red car carried on under it.
"I win. Mine went furthest,"
Patrick cheered. "Well done. Always be a winner, son," his mother cheered, and leaving him to play, she began washing the breakfast dishes. Her movements were deft, but her thoughts were a jumble of memories that her reflection in the mirror had evoked. Where had all the years gone? "Come May the 3rd, I'll be Mrs. John Sykes," she told herself as she rinsed the last cup. "Not every woman's as fortunate as ye are, Kitty Conlon. This time round, you'll have a marriage built on love and respect, and a hefty dose of passion.
"You-hoo! Anyone at home?"
Maggie's raucous shout broke Kitty's reverie. "Where else?" Kitty called back as she stacked the clean plates and dishes into the cupboards in the alcove beside the black iron range. Maggie strolled in, as familiar with Kitty's kitchen as she was with her own. Although, Maggie being Maggie, her kitchen was cluttered and none too clean.
"Rotten weather, ain't it?" she moaned. "Have you time for a cuppa?"
She sat down at the table and lit a cigarette.
"Always," said Kitty, filling the kettle at the sink. "And yes, the weather is lousy. Me and Patrick got soaked on our way back. I hope it's not like this on me wedding day."
She grimaced as she put the kettle on the hob.
"Lily and Molly were in school before the heavens opened, thank goodness." "Did our Lily give you any bother?" "She didn't want to go this morning. Carried on something shocking, so she did, the little mare."
Maggie loved her daughter with a passion, but she didn't have much patience with Lily's tantrums.
"She was as good as gold, went in like a lamb," said Kitty, who, in the early years of Lily's life, had helped Maggie rear her. Mothering didn't come naturally to Maggie. Lily was the result of an affair that Maggie had had during the war whilst her husband, Fred, was in Egypt. He'd doubted her paternity from the start. When his suspicions were confirmed, he'd beaten Maggie cruelly, and with Kitty's help, Maggie had thrown him out. Seeing as how he was a work-shy, vicious drunk who regularly used his fists on Maggie, she had been glad to see the back of him. "She never acts up with you,"
Maggie groused, failing to realise that it was Kitty's natural love for children and her patience that kept Lily in check. The kettle whistled, and Kitty brewed the tea.
"What were you up to before I came in?"
Maggie asked.
Kitty smiled. "Remembering," she said, filling 2 cups. "We were only 19 when we first met. Can you believe that, Maggie? I'd just arrived from Ireland, and you came out and let me know you didn't think much of the Irish." She laughed. "Some welcome that was."
"Yeah, and look at us now. We stick together like shit to a blanket," said Maggie, raising her cup to toast her words.
"Language, Maggie."
Kitty glanced in Patrick's direction before readily agreeing.
"Aye, we do. And in these past 8 years we've surely had some hard knocks, but we've always risen above 'em."
She sipped her tea, a faraway look in her eyes, as, unexpected, her thoughts drifted back to Tom and his betrayal.
"What are you daydreaming about?" Maggie demanded. "You were miles away."
Kitty smiled gently.
"I keep thinking about Tom, Maggie. Even memories that hurt have a habit of sneaking up and catching you unawares."
"You're dead daft remembering stuff like that.
You've put it all behind you. You've got a bloody smashing fella in John Sykes, and your Molly and Patrick are a credit to you." "I know. I couldn't want for more," Kitty said wholeheartedly. "It just feels a bit strange, me planning to get wed again." "Strange?" Maggie squawked. "You've kept the poor bugger waiting long enough. I'm sure John's fed up to the back teeth."
And mimicking Kitty's Irish accent, she added,
"Yea, and you're carping on about it's only decent to wait 2 or 3 years. I don't know what you were thinking. Everybody knew Tom was cheating on you, so it's not as though they expected you to be the grieving widow for the rest of your life." "Shush, Maggie."
Kitty put her finger to her lips, glancing anxiously again in Patrick's direction, but he was paying them no heed. In his opinion,